Carmsley Hill City Farm is a wonderful place for a family day out. Children can meet, feed and pat all manner of creatures in safety under the supervision of trained farm handlers. They can see how sheepdogs work to round up sheep or how to crack a whip. They can take a tractor ride or milk a cow and see how sheep are sheared. But my very first visit to what is now called Carmsley Hill City Farm was a mixture of adventurous curiosity tempered by anxious insecurities. In those early days, Carmsley Hill was called Grenfell Farm, and none of those beautiful homes all around existed then. It was rural farmland. My father was a squadron leader in the Royal Air Force and had been posted to Singapore as military advisor prior to the handover from English rule. I was a complete innocent abroad, and like most English people, had no idea of what Australian rural life was about, nor how tough it really was. But I did know that once I turned 16, the RAF would no longer subsidise my family, and they would have to pay my airfares to Singapore. I did not fancy Singapore, so I decided to emigrate to Australia instead. In mid-February 1959, I packed my bags, said goodbye to my family, my relatives, and set sail from Tilbury Docks with the Big Brother movement for a rural life in Australia. On the 13th of March 1959, I was 16 and 4 months when our ship, the Stratheden, arrived in Sydney. As soon as we had docked and passed immigration, our Big Brother minders transported those of us who had volunteered for rural life 35 kilometres west of Sydney to Carmsley Hill, then known as Grenfell, their training farm. We were bunked into dormitory-like sheds, about 10 to 12 to a shed. I was used to that after years of boarding school in the UK. Our dining shed was simple, with louvered windows and ceiling fans to help us get used to Australia's hot weather. Our training started immediately. We learned to milk cows, tend to cattle, horses and chickens. We learned to ride while the Big Brother organisers found us jobs. 34 days after arriving in Australia, my Big Brother organiser said he'd found me a job and took me to Sydney's Central Rail Station. I had hoped for a job in the Tasmanian apple orchards, but it seemed I had to settle for a job on a sheep station 500 kilometres northwest of Sydney. My Big Brother told me I would be met when I arrived as he waved me goodbye. I slept badly in my seat on the night train to Narrabri. I'd been instructed on arrival to catch the motor rail train and get off at Cryon. The motor rail was basically a bus with train wheels. It carried mail and local passengers from Narrabri to Walgett and all stops in between. The driver assured me he would drop me off at Cryon. About mid-morning, the train stopped at a siding ramp with just a small corrugated iron shed on it. It was Cryon. The driver let me off with my suitcase and a canvas bag of mail. Already the sun was high and the day was hot. I had no water or food and only the tin shed for shade. As far as I could see to the horizon, there was nothing but sunburnt, featureless land. And those buildings in the distance did not exist back then. As the first hour passed, I began to feel apprehensive. In the heat haze on the horizon, I thought I saw a glint of light. As it grew closer, it became a dust-covered vehicle, streaming a cloud of dust behind it. I picked up my suitcase as the man in well-worn khaki shorts, shirt, and a battered wide-brimmed hat got out. But it turned out he was only the local mailman and had come to pick up the canvas bag of mail. He gave me some water, and then in a couple of minutes I was alone again. It seemed another hour passed before again I saw a glimmer of light in the heat haze. It grew to become a beat-up old Land Rover. A giant of a man got out. He was dressed pretty much the same as the mailman had been, but he was at least 6'6" tall. He was the son of my new employer and introduced himself as Bill. I climbed into the Land Rover feeling rather intimidated, but glad I had been picked up from the middle of nowhere. Bill drove for a while. The sheep farm we were going to was called Corrali, 35 kilometers away, but the dirt road was in poor shape. It made the going slow. As we drove, I felt my heart sinking. The land was so desolate, so dry, so dead-looking, nothing like the green farm fields of England. Arriving at the property's gate did not help me feel any better, nor did the rough dirt road leading up to the homestead. Bill's father was a tough, weathered-looking stockman called Bob. He showed me where I'd be living. That was another shock. My new home was a small room in an old corrugated iron shed with no comforts of any kind, baking under the hot Australian sun. To wash, I had to use a cold water tap on the outside of the shed for my morning ablutions. My toilet was a hole in the ground 30 meters away, surrounded by a corrugated iron toilet shed. To wash my clothes, I had to boil them in a red 44-gallon drum 30 meters away and chop my own wood to do it. My shower was a cold water shower head coming from a bore water tower behind the shed. Next door to my little room was a grain feed shed. It attracted mice and rats, but worse in turn, they attracted snakes, all highly venomous. Each morning I had to lean over my bed to carefully check under it and into my work boots to make sure no snakes, mice, or tarantula spiders had come to visit. Next to the feed shed was a stable to keep horses ready for an early morning start the next day. Inside the tiny room, there was only a wireframe single bed and a small wardrobe. There was no chair or fan and only a single bulb in the ceiling. Electrical power for the property was 48 volts, generated by a diesel motor and batteries in the other part of my shed. Often that diesel motor pounded away all night, so I had to get used to sleeping through its noise. The only view of the world through my small window in my tiny room was the corrugated iron dog kennel some 40 meters away. I often felt the dogs had better accommodations than I did. At least they did not have the mice, rats, snakes, spiders, or the noisy diesel engine that pounded away all night. But time is a great teacher, and I adapted just as hundreds of other lads from the UK have done. It gave me a taste for adventure, and I wanted to see how others survived the outback. In the following decades, I travelled all around Australia, then all over the world to places I could not have imagined existed. Over 5 decades later, after that first visit, I rediscovered Grenfell Farm, to find it was now called Carmsley Hill City Farm. In 2010, I'd made my second visit and was happy to see the old buildings and water tower still remained, and the old dining shed had become a Big Brother movement heritage. Just as I had adapted to dramatic changes in my life, so had Australia. My wife was born in Shanghai and now an Australian citizen. That too is something that would have been impossible in 1959 when I first arrived at Carmsley Hill City Farm. I very much enjoyed taking my overseas relatives and guests to Carmsley City Farm for the day to show them Australia's unique wildlife, domesticated animals and farm practices. Neither language or nationality seemed to be a problem for animals on the farm while you have a paper bag of feed for them. The farm attendants are friendly, knowledgeable and do their jobs well. Patting animals always brings out smiles from children and adults alike. It is often a new experience for visitors who have grown up in large cities. While Carmsley Farm is about as far away from reality as you can get from a real Australian farm, it's a special place for kids, and many schools take day trips there. It is also a special place for me. It's where I began my new life in Australia. Since then, a lot of water has passed under my personal bridge. Some of its waters were wild and dark, but as I approach my twilight years, I regret none of it. However, I do hope that future generations do not have to bear the hardships previous generations went through to make Australia their home. Carmsley City Farm is a place of heritage for many young men just arrived from overseas to experience their first adventure of Australian life. I invite you to share that experience, that same adventure of Australian heritage with your children.